Okay, this is a little bit embarrassing, but anyway, uh, yeah, I mean, I was quite tired last night and I was still fasting, and I certainly made a lot of clerical errors in what I was saying, also because I wasn't referencing it to things inside of my head and I was trying to do it virtually. And let me just excuse myself that the problems that I have are that essentially this model of personality pathology and a model of self-actualization uh, is in fact pretty complicated, that you can't sort of create a stencil that contains both. You have to have two separate diagrams or two separate sort of stencils over the 17 model to even make heads or tails of what's going on. And but I made quite a stupid sort of uh, comment when I was trying to deal with that seventh thing at the end there, because there are seven functions which overlap between each side of the mind. Anyway, this got me thinking as I've been trying to piece it together now, because I mean, in some sense, I haven't fully synthesized a model of self-actualization. Um, Partly because I'm still going through the process myself, and now I've just reread the seven churches in Revelations, and I wanted to make some raw notes about this, although sadly this is going to still be conjecturous, but I just felt that I must update this because of the mistakes that I've made in earlier recordings. My most immediate recording, which was certainly embarrassing with the seven sort of overlap things, which then I completely misspoke about. Because as me being a Metatype 13, the last so essentially there are so it was a whole sort of strange mathematical thing that I was even doing, but basically each side of the mind, of which there are four sides of the mind, has six uh, organs within it, has the same pattern of six organs, but they all do take on a peculiar sort of role because of their ontological development and their particular internal relation, and internal sort of schematic and dynamics. They each come out quite differently, and there are four sides of the mind, and in some sense there are four deaths. Therefore, because each side of the mind has got its own death and its own lust and its own vanity and its own enticed lust and its own trial and its own sin. But the trial and the sin of one side of the mind is the death and the lust of another side of the mind. And just to translate this language into MBTI-esque language, Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is an approximate model which I have helped to develop, the four sides of the mind model of MBTI, with authors, which is embarrassing that I can't even recall their names, but these are the strange vagaries of sort of what a private self-read expert in uh, well, anyway, people do know about me in the field. I don't want to brag or say things that are frankly un verifiable anyway. So it's somewhat pointless to mention these things or to rattle off these things. But not to derail myself too much, the lust is the child function. Uh, the vanity is the dominant function or the hero function. The enticed lust is the parent function, and the trial is the inferior function. So that's how it works in MBTI, in an MBTI-esque translation. Um, Now, uh, the thing is that the super ego, which in my view is the parent function in the super ego, or the enticed lust in the super ego, is the beginning of the false ego complex, is the beginning of the fallen personality, and in some senses part of the acquisition of a first language. A child, I don't believe, can develop a first language without the development of a false ego complex, or without the development of what you could also call the false prophet. That parent function, I believe, should be referred to as the false prophet. Anyway, it's not the false prophet's fault. Let me just say that. In some sense, the false prophet is a self-induced delusion, and in some sense, it is. Before it became the false prophet, it was basically the tree of life, and it becomes then the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it is, in some sense, I believe, remedied in Revelations in the address to the first church, that the state of the false prophet is itself addressed as a church, and that it must keep its candlestick, and it is being treated by the Spirit of God, by the effigy of the Son of God, to hearken and to condition itself and to keep itself a certain way. And so anyway, so that parent function is the entreatment of the first church. Now, this is different to what I suggested in many of my earlier recordings, because what I thought is that the 7 heads of the beast and the 10 horns, which I do believe that I have accurately demarcated. In some sense, I assumed that the 7 heads of the beast would correspond with the 7 churches. And that might still be the case. Maybe I should alter my model of the 7 heads of the beast. To tell you the truth, I'm not actually at this point in time focused on the 7 heads of the beast, so I'll have to review that. But the 10 horns, I definitely believe I have a hold on exactly what the 10 horns are. Anyway, but there are lots of 10s that are spoken of. The second church, when it is addressed, it is said that some of you will go to prison for 10 days. And I believe that that is a direct reference to the second death, but it's it's not actually a direct reference to the second death, because it's indirectly a reference to the second death, because if you go 10 starting, so the second church would be the address of the child function in the subconscious, or the trial of the superego, because those are the same. No, I've just misspoken. The second church is the address of the trial of the superego, which is also the death of the subconscious. So the second church is already intimately linked with abstractly or abstrusely, it's correlated with death, because it is the death of the superego, and it's being tugged at by the first church, or by what is being addressed in the address of the first church, which it is very interesting, because in the first church, what is promised to the first church is that those who follow the direction and that keep to these particular edifying comportment will eat of the tree of life, because that is what I think is directly concerned, because the state of the false prophet is displacing the tree of life, and it's in some sense how to get back to that in its current sort of decomposed state of the knowledge of good and evil. And so you can see that how the first church is being addressed is, in some sense, you could say it's being addressed to the knowledge of good and evil within the false ego complex. Anyway, which is because that is quite confidently the false prophet, the superego's parent function, which has no confusion. In some sense, it's the least confused element in the whole false ego complex. But anyway, things progress. So the second church is the death of the subconscious, or the trial of the false prophet. So the toxicity in the second church is in some sense going to be a holdover from the state of whatever the state is of the first church. And in some sense, the second church then is also the ground zero for all sorts of problems. It's interesting how the second church is counseled. It says that you essentially complain that you're poor, but you are also rich, but it says but you are rich. And so the richness of the abundance, the actual abundance of the second church, which is in some sense the source of all tribulation, which manifests 10 dimensions above its head, which is after the second death in some sense. So whatever is happening in the second church is actually directly corresponded to what survives the second death. That whatever is in the second, that is the source material that will either make it through or that won't make it through the second death. So there's a direct correspondence between what is going on in the second church and what will survive, what will be, I don't want to say like what will survive, but the things that there are that can have a candidate chance of making it through the second death. Anyway, because if you go 10 dimensions from that dimension, above it, you are inarguably the middling between either the sin of the unconscious or the lust or the child function of the ego, which are the same thing. Which have already gone through the filter of the second death, which is the unconscious's trial function. Okay. Anyway, so the third church, which we must remember, is the child function of the subconscious, or the sin of the false prophet, or the sin of the superego, which is in some sense the superego's parent function, does not really have a trial and a sin because it doesn't own its own child function to care about sinning against. Because you can only have a sin if your child function, if the lust, if the corruption of the will stays in a non-executed state. Basically, when the child function is dishonored, when the lust is dishonored, then you are proven sinful, because you had a temperament, you had a disposition which was in some form of desire, in some expectancy, in some and it essentially gets it gets proven to be insoluble in the trial, and in some sense the trial in fact negates the child function or the lust. The trial is what is in some sense the antidote to the lust. The trial is antithetical to the lust, or the inferior function is antithetical to the child function, and then the resultant sin is merely the resignation or the relenting into what have I done. And then as soon as you conclude the sentence of what you have instead done, rather than executing upon the honoring of the child function, or the lust is conclusively dishonored, and therefore you have missed your own target, which was essentially embodied by the child function. So the problem really is the child function in some ontological sense, but these words are just descriptive layers. Anyway, we'll see the importance of the dominant function, which is the next thing. So the fourth church. Should I maybe just say so how the third church is counseled is that it says, don't get into worshipping Balaam and fornication and sort of idolatry and things like that. Instead, like I'll give you hidden manna to eat from, and that is also where the promise of the white stone comes in. And this is also another mistake that I made in other recordings, where I said I always associated the white stone to the fifth church, to Sardis. And I still think that I'm roughly correct, because it is all linked together, but that's maybe a bit too easy for me to say, but I'll bear that out. But let me get into this. So the third church, I've also been, the reason why I've been looking at this is because I've been trying to get a better, stronger model of self-actualization after the crucifixion, because in some sense I think that there's a two-stage, which is even described in Revelations, where basically you have to do a lot of the self-cleaning, a lot of the self-work. And then what happens is you get a kind of in some sense, the internal psychological alchemy, if I can sound like a bit of a mystic, is that you're trying to actually steel man the problem so that you can conclusively defeat it. So, in some sense, you're getting to grips with the shape and the outline of all the failure modes, of all the points of stress, and you are, in doing this, you are finding a way to streamline a vaccine. Essentially, you're kind of doing a vaccine. Um, and I know that that's not what I'm talking about right now, but essentially the dominant function that was always, in some sense, either nebulous, or the eighth beast that is not a beast but yet is a beast, the sort of the eighth head, which can be, anyway. See, again, I don't know if I want to equate this to the seven-headed beast, or if that model that I had was good for a time and then it sort of changes its shape. But I do find it interesting, because in some sense I think that I was more interested in the beast stuff than I was in the churches, and I do think that the church stuff only makes sense after you've already started the crucifixion, the work of the crucifixion. Until you get that ordered, I don't think it's even relevant. And in some sense, now I'm just kind of trying to refine the model of the new personality, or the self-actualization. Anyway, all these sort of strange things. So the dominant function in the superego is the New Jerusalem. It still doesn't have a uh, a child function, and it still doesn't have a death. Those are vacant, and in some sense, they are taken up in the ego's inferior function, which in some sense becomes a kind of, I still think of it as a kind of like a solid state crux. in which it's just a kind of computational, procedural sort of this is a horrible analogy, but I mean, it's meant to. I see it as like a magic 8 ball that you ask it a question and you shake it up, and then it just gives you a static answer. But it's not. That's almost a horrible answer because that's not. It's based on chance or something, or it's based on stochastic nonsense or whatever. Whereas I think that the ego actually becomes like anyway, becomes a very refined, segregated sort of set of shouldering responsibility for connecting the inferior function in some sense. See, again, what I'm saying as well might also be outdated because so the technology of the crucifixion, which takes the inferior function in the ego and in some sense uses that inferior function in the ego to ignite the New Jerusalem, which is the dominant function in the superego. And once the dominant function starts running, then perhaps there is a new model of that the ego takes, like on an augmented character. But I don't want to speculate too much further. But otherwise, I would just be happy at this point to say that I feel that once the second death is survived, you see, again, maybe I'm going too much because in some sense the focus that I have gotten to, what I'm focusing on really is how to stabilize the dominant function in the unconscious. Now that I have worked out, I believe that the dominant function in the unconscious is not included in the 7 churches. That the dominant function in the unconscious is above the last church. And in some sense, it is the beast. That in some sense, when the 7 churches have kind of perfected their work, I think what will especially happen is that the promise of the 4th church, the promises to the 4th church, will also empower that beast, the unconscious dominant function. It will also, because the unconscious dominant function will gain access to everything below it. And then it will be empowered to then do a final attack on New Jerusalem. And then at the same time, it will be excoriated from all of its unholiness. In some sense, holy fire will come and will defeat the armies that come up against the New Jerusalem. So in some sense, I think that the synthesis of the 7 churches will be in the dominant function. Of the unconscious, which is in some sense it will become, I think, the feat of the new personality. Anyway, so I'm streaming on ahead. Let me. And because the thing is that I don't want to skip too far ahead. Okay, so the 4th church, is the dominant function. In the subconscious, and that's the one that talks about the Jezebels. That basically the problem with the 4th church is basically that they don't understand the depth of Satan, and they're sort of they have this kind of sympathy heuristic that they love the last greater than the first. And in some sense, I think this directly corresponds much later in Revelations when it talks about the sea giving up its dead. I think is directly correspondent to the fourth church. And as the sea gives up its dead, it will also empower the dominant function in the unconscious, which will have many things that are worthy of being proven in the fire, in the holy fire. Anyway, I should have said as well that my linkage of Sardis with what was actually spoken about, the white stone that was spoken about, to the third church. The reason why I link Sardis with that, even though it was only spoken, Sardis is the fifth church, and I was, when I was referencing this, I was confusing the promise to the fifth church with what was spoken about to the third church. But I do think that there is a special connection between the third church and the fifth church. The third church being the one that has the problem with Balaam and fornication and idolatry, is that it says the two-edged sword. So the third church says, "This is who speaks to you, the one with the two-edged sword," and then the promise at the end is that they will have a white stone that will have a name. Now, that only he who receives it will be able to read the name on the white stone to the third. That is what is said to the third church. Now, all of that, I think, is actually said in some sense from the higher perch of the fifth church. I think that is almost what it is so, to me, closely connected to the promise of the fifth church, that they have to almost be seen together in some sense, because the two-edged sword is the parent function. The parent function must become a two-edged sword. And so what is being spoken of to the church of Sardis, to the fifth church, I believe, is the condition of the fifth church is the condition of that two-edged sword. So I think that in some sense, when it says that this is he who speaks to this church, it's talking from another point of view, and I think that point of view is the fifth church. Or at least the angel of the fifth church. Something like that. Okay, now I haven't proven that point, so let me talk about the fifth church. So in the fifth church, and I'm probably, I just have my sparse notes that I made about this, but the promise given to the fifth church is that the name will not be that if you do what is asked, or if you have, I can't actually remember exactly what it is, patience, or if you hold fast. No, that wasn't what was spoken of, I think. No, it's not holding fast. Anyway, but whatever the stipulation was in to the fifth church, the promise is that your name will not be blotted out of the book of life, and you'll have a white raiment, and that the name will be spoken of to my Father. So those in the fifth church, in the church of Sardis, who are holy and righteous, that there are elements in the parent function that when they have this two-edged character, when they have this two-edged sword about them, when they are discerning, because there are some people in the fifth church that are of right mind, that they will be given white raiment, and their name will not be blotted out of the book of life, and that their name will be spoken of to the Father, and also that name, when it is spoken of, it will be heard by the angels of those people. who their name, because their name is not blotted out of the book of life. And so the name is given so much weight that I link it to the white stone in some sense, that has the name on it that only you can read it. But in some sense, it's just taken from a much simpler. In the third church, it's on a much more basic level. The idea is that you will be able to know the name, read the name yourself. That is the promise of the third church, is that you will actually have the eye, the discerning, to see it yourself. And to the fifth church, it is essentially the promise is more robust in terms of what the name does. Anyway, now I link the fifth church also to the calm waters, which is right at the end of Revelation. It talks about an angel that will throw a stone, I think it might have even been a white stone, into the water, to be lost in the water. And so I think that in some sense the white stone gets cast by the angel into the water of the perfected state of the fifth church anyway. And that's the proper state of the self-actualized parent function in the subconscious. Now, the sixth church is very much resonant, I believe, with the first church, because the first church, sorry, I've just misspoken. The sixth church is very much correspondent with the second church, because they both are correspondent with deaths. That the seventh church is the death of the subconscious, which is in some sense not a real death, because it would have to be the death of the last side of the mind, or the child function in the last side of the mind, and there is no child function from the superego. So in some sense, the first death is correspondent with what is being addressed in the sixth church, which is the Church of Philadelphia. Anyway, so the Church of Philadelphia, the promise given to the Church of Philadelphia, and this was very gratifying to me when reading this, because I already, in my own model of the self-actualized personality, with this inkling that for me to slightly reposition the order of the seven churches, to start with the parent function and not to, of the superego, and not to start with the death of the subconscious, but to start with one below that. When I did that, I was trying to work out where all the water stuff happened, or how you get from watery stuff into solid footing. Anyway, and I just kind of assumed that there has to be this white stone that has a name on it, and then in some sense there has to be a synthesis of some ability of reading that name that gets fully embodied, sort of closer to the break point. And anyway, I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself talking about this, but because in some sense this, I think, refers more to the last church, in which a lot of the stuff is synthesized, but the base ingredient for it is the sixth church, which specifically talks about being a pillar in the temple of God, and having the name of God and the name of the city of God and the name of your new name. So reading is I would say that the general sort of uh, that's I could probably find a better word than that, but anyway. Um, oh, damn! I forgot an important thing, but let me not jump around too much. And so all this ability of I should probably read this again, because then I would have a much more in-depth sort of commentary about it. Yeah, let me actually do that. Otherwise, this is going to be too embarrassing. Let me just read from Philadelphia. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth, and no man shutteth, and shutteth, and no man openeth. I know thy works, behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it, for thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, and I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Yeah, so I mean, it's talking in addressing what I believe is the first death, or the death of the death that is the basis of the unconscious side of the mind, um, and it is in some sense giving a promise of the dominant function in the superego, which will, in some sense, fix all the problems. Because in some sense, this death in the unconscious is the death of the unconscious, because it is the trial. It is very uncomfortable for the subconscious. It is the trial of the subconscious, which is the death of the unconscious. It takes on both of those facets. So, it's just kind of doom and gloom to some degree. So you have to wait quite a while to get all the way from the 11th dimension to the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 17, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you have to go literally 11 days past that. So you just have to, I mean, did it say hold fast? I think it did say hold fast. Anyway, so this is going to be embarrassing because I don't know how to pronounce Laodiceans. And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, These things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Because thou sayest, I am rich, and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked? I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. As many as I love I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous therefore, and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and sup with him, and he with me. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. And that is the seventh church, the last church, which corresponds to the sin of the subconscious, or the child function, or the lust of the unconscious. Now, the thing that I left out to say was to talk about one of the promises that is given to the fourth church, which is the church that has the problem with the sympathy and with the Jezebel, that is promised the hidden manna. No, sorry, excuse me. That's not promised the hidden manna. That's the third church. Excuse me, my notes are a bit a mess. That is what I would correspond with the sea giving up the dead, and the problem with the fourth church is that it does not care about the depth of Satan. It does not care to understand. Or that's what benights that church. In any case, that's what benights the dominant function in the subconscious. But one of the promises that is given is that to him that holds properly, I can't remember, maybe I should just read it out, but if the fourth church is the proper people in the fourth church, what is promised is that if you can make it through the challenges in the dominant function of the subconscious, that you will be given an iron rod to rule the nations and the morning star. So all the power is correspondent to the fourth church, is the work of keeping the dominant function in the subconscious, to keeping it just or righteous or holy. And how the speaker or the angel appears to the fourth church, as it says, now I can't remember the first thing, but it says that my feet are of fine bronze, and I think it basically says that I have good stature of, or it says some symbolic thing that says that I'm a proper and true person. Let me just read it out rather than be so embarrassed. Okay, I just need to work out how I'm going to pronounce this church. Thyatira, Thyatira, I guess. And the angel of the church in Thyatira writes, And these things saith the Son of God, who hath the eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. I know thy works and charity and service and faith, and thy patience and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Behold, I will cast her into her bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. And I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. And unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan, as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden. As many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan. A lack of doctrine and lack of knowledge of the awareness of darkness. And that which ye have already hold fast till I come. And he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. And essentially, the morning star. Oh my word, I'm blanking on it now. I link the morning star essentially to the angel that throws the white stone, or the stone into the. In some sense, it's. I don't think it is necessarily the white stone. It is the, let's say, the counterfeit stone into the waters, that it's hidden. And being able, in some sense, to read the white stone on the surface of those calm waters, of those now rested waters. Now, I'm talking in anticipation of this, because the waters are not actually rested. Even once the angel throws away the counterfeit stone, the waters are still, they still have that motion in it. It still has to be discharged. And again, there's going to be a kind of the precipitation of the morning star. Is essentially, I think, going to empower the beast one last time to be reproven for a conclusive sort of reproof in an assault against the newly established New Jerusalem. But a lot of this can, I think, be roughly sort of internalized, although it will be a project. I think it will in some sense, I think this kind of proves the non-dualism of true spirituality, that there is a I don't want to get too much into the technical detail of the field circuits and such, but that you have the, and I went into this in the last recording quite extensively, but basically those sorts of themes that I spoke about as I was remarking on things from the triadic heart of Siva, if I'm saying that right. but the three realities spoken about, or the three distinct sort of metaphysical issues, the reality of God, the reality of the self, and the reality of the potential of karma, if I put it like that. Which I guess maybe I do disagree with that, because I do actually think that they can be quite closely integrated. Which is perhaps exactly correspondent with the new name spoken of to the sixth church. Anyway, okay, so yeah, so the question really is what happens after the seven churches? Because there are references to the seven churches to objects far afield. New Jerusalem is spoken about, to the Church of Philadelphia, which is very interesting because that is, let me just think if that's a juxtaposition, because the sixth church is well, I've really called it the first death. Or you could call it the first trial that results in a death in the next side of the mind. And then there's something in the child function in the subconscious, which is the second church, which is the source material of whatever will actually graduate from the second death, which gets you right into the further models in Revelations, which I probably will need a third stencil, so everything I'm about to say now is probably a sort of pinch of salt, but I'm pretty certain that the ego's parent function are the names of blasphemy, is the woman who sits atop of the scarlet dragon. The scarlet dragon is the dominant function in the ego, and the child function is the precipitate from the second death, because the second death is the ego's death, or the unconscious's inferior function. So it's really, it all comes up to the second death. If you can survive the second death, then your ego can have a hope of starting to do the work of the crucifixion. Sort of overcoming that second death is the firewall, really, of let's say spiritual comportment up till then. Which is, I think, primarily, well, I depict it in terms of the 10 horns, which essentially culminate between the dominant function in the subconscious, which is also the fourth church, corresponding to the work of the fourth church, which will link up to the dominant function in the unconscious, which I've called the beast before. And those make a string of 5. And then there's a sympathetic string of 5 from the top, that links the woman on top of the dragon, the names of blasphemy, in the ego, the parent function in the ego, which corresponds then 5 dimensions lower with the parent function in the unconscious. And so the the parent function in the ego becomes this kind of queen bee, becomes this sort of whore of Babylon. And the parent function in the unconscious is really just a pale reflection of the parent function in the ego. And that balances itself against, let's say, the unconscious. In some sense, that thing that I just said between the parent functions is much more unconscious, although it's much more at the front of the mind, because especially when it's expressed in the dominant function of the ego and the parent function of the ego, those are highly conscious. Like, those are your actual thoughts in your mind, are the parent function and the dominant function in your ego. That is your actual thread of thinking. Whereas your unconscious dominant function and subconscious dominant function are in some sense embodied, habituated, enculturated patterns of, in some sense, they are like the sacred cow. And this might even be what is being spoken of in the triadic heart of Siva, that the dead, when the sea gives up its dead, I wonder if it's Rurka, I'm not sure, but if it's the figure that is connected with what I connect to the sword that keeps the way of the cherubim that keeps the way of the tree of life, but that what comes out of the sea is a cow and a crow, and I think that perhaps the cow is the dominant function and the crow might, anyway, but that's superimposition. But anyway, but that might be one way of talking about these structures within the 10 horns. But it's also a lot more complicated than that, because there are lots of other ways in which that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if we wanted, see, like, I still don't know where I would put the beast now with 7 heads. If it would really just be on top of the 7 churches. But then I would have to think again about, oh, and then the third, and then the 8, because I mean the 7-headed beast also talks about the 8th, which is not a beast and yet is, and that could either be the vacancy of the New Jerusalem, but it could also be on the other side of the 7 churches. It could be it could be the 8th church, and or it could be it could be on either side, and in some sense it could be a way in which the lack of the functioning of the 7 churches essentially transposes the vacancy of the New Jerusalem onto the beastly nature of the beast that is not a beast and yet is, and the 8 that is part of the 7, as it is described in Revelations. The 8 that is one of the 7, or is one, I can't remember, but it basically says that the 8th is part of the set of the 7. It says that it is of the 7. The 8th beast is of the 7, or something like that. And so then that would be in some sense, the kind of mercurial ambiguity of the 13th. Or sorry, I say 13th. In my personality style, because I'm a metatype 13, it corresponds to 13. That 8th for my type corresponds to that. anyway, so if I speculate that, then where do I put the 7? Well, then I would be putting it on top of it, and then the 13th would be the 8th. Yeah. So if I did that, and then I talk about the 10 horns going from 9 to 1, in some sense it might be wrong to say that the 10 horns go from 9 to 1. Where would they go then? So the reason why I wouldn't put the 10 horns 9 to 1 is because it kind of weirdly intersects all that junk about because, okay, so when I said 1 to 9, again, I'm talking about my own metatype. That's not a generalizable point. But so if 1 in my type is the names of blasphemy, 17 is the scarlet dragon, and then that's like sits on top of many waters, which would be 16 and 15, because the 16 and 15 are the shared child function and death, or lust and death of the ego, but they are also the sin and the inferior function of the unconscious. So that's the many waters. And then below that is the parent function in the unconscious. And the parent function in the unconscious and the many waters together, I believe, are the three sources of the unclean spirits that spew out of their mouths like frogs. And the unclean spirits are the spirits of the beast, of the dragon, and of the false prophet. Perhaps not in that order. The beast, the false prophet, and the dragon. And so until those unclean spirits come out of that, then the dominant function, which is the scarlet dragon, and the names of blasphemy that sits on top of the scarlet dragon, will not be disempowered well enough for the inferior function of the ego, which must do the work of the crucifixion, to sacrifice the names of blasphemy, to sacrifice the fleshly thinking of the names of blasphemy, and to precipitate responsibility for the sin of the ego, which is also the sin, which is in some sense the sin of the world. It's not the sin of the self, because the ego, in some sense, is very much blameless, because the ego just inherited a bad deal from the unconscious, which is in some sense all coming from the false prophet originally. Which is basically the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so that's, and it's because of that I don't like to put the horns there. But that does all fall neatly from 14 upwards. So if I wanted to put the 10 horns somewhere else, where did I originally used to put them? From 16 to, it would be 16, 15, 14, 13, that's 4. 12, 11, 10, 9, that's another 4, 8, 7, that makes 10. From 7 to 16, that makes 10 horns. That was my original model of the beast. And I don't know, I think that kind of, I still like that model of those 10 horns. It's just not relevant to me at this point of development after the crucifixion. It's just the 10-horned beast is not relevant. But let me talk about the three-headed beast now and see if I can model that. So what would the three-headed beast is? Because when the beast returns, one of the heads is wounded or maimed or something, and the head that is wounded, I think, is the first head to fall in the beastly structure. Is, I would say, the unclean spirits that come out. Although I might be completely wrong about this, because I might be skipping ahead, and I've actually might have to study this and make sure that I've got the sequence of it right. But well, let me see, the first 7 heads that I used to talk about was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, from 7 to 13, that's 7. That was the original 7 head. That was the original. So that was my original model of the 10 horns, and original model 10 horns. And now I am going from 13 to 7, and that was my original model of the 7-headed beast. And let me just think if that compares unfavorably with, because the 7 churches start with dimension 6, but the beast, my original beast model, starts with dimension 7. So yeah, I think I'm happy with all of that, because the 7 churches is taking a model of self-actualization. It's taking the methodology of salvation. It's a description of the end of your world, but how that world comports itself as a conditioning, as a beastly form of conditioned by one's environs, being imprinted and limited by worldly authority. That model starts from 7, because that is from the position of the subconscious. It's not in the meta, the metaphysical truth that the false prophets. So I mean, in some sense, it's the difference between knowing about the false prophet and still, because in some sense the false prophet is the god of the world as well. It is the agent, at least it's, at the very least, it's the agent of the god of the world, but in some sense I think it is the god of the world, or at least it's your personal god of the world, and it is in the same vogue as all other forms of false authority, although they come in different flavors. But it is your personal idolatry in some sense. So when I put that together, I'm still happy with that model of the 7-headed beast. Have I got that right? Yeah, because 13 is 7. From 7 to 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now, and then, yeah, and then the 10 horns from 7 to 16. Now you see that I'm still not sure about the 10 horns. Because as I said, I've got this other model between 9 and 1. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1. That is also 10. So which one should I prefer? And why am I even looking at that 10? I mean, how I draw it is quite strange. I draw it as like a triangle at the top. So from 1 to 14, 14 is the base of the triangle, and I put a circle at the 1. It's almost like the eye of Saruman. Looks like a pyramid. and then I draw a circle around 13 and a circle around 9, and I make that a circle. So there's kind of like a group of 5 that looks like a circle, and there's a triangle on top of that. And that is basically, as far as I can tell, the toxicity of Keegan stage, well, what I would call it sort of being stuck in Keegan stage 3, but Keegan thinks that as long as you put that in some kind of equilibrium, that you've kind of that you've got a stable Keegan stage 4. I would call it nihilism or philosophical sophistry. And then I think Keegan thinks, in some sense, well, I mean, I'm projecting this because I'm getting this from secondhand sources. I haven't read Keegan, but that if you have enough dynamic exchange between these two bodies, that you kind of have a meta fluidity or something like that. But in some sense, it's all based on cleverly subjugating one's own inferior function. Um, in the ego, it's all built on piling up bodies and bearing them under the inferior function in the ego. Uh, as well as essentially the second death, and I would probably also say the first death. That the second death and the first death are, it's just like there's this thread of trauma, there's this thread of failure, which the whole thing is sort of built on, and it can only compensate for that, where in the top 5 it compensates for that from parent functions, and in the bottom 5 it compensates for that out of dominant functions. And that way it contains the toxicity quite well of the first death, but it quite badly contains the toxicity of the second death, um, because the parent functions are essentially um, forming the structure to try and symbolize directionality, to try to sort of make a kind of a fake fire, a fake. I mean, so this is, I'm doing sort of alchemical symbolism here, but sort of triangles I've always used to symbolize structure, and uh, and directionality in some sense. But anyway, this is getting a bit too far flung. But yeah, I'm actually happy with all of these structures. It's just I am now, I think, beyond dealing with the beast and the 10 horns. I'm literally dealing with the last occurrence of the beast, perhaps, but also with what to do in the aftermath of. You see, this is my biggest problem: is that as far as I can tell, there's not really much discussion in Revelations. Or I need to. I say that prematurely because I need to read it, the whole thing of it again, before I can really properly say this. But apart from the frogs coming out of those dimensions, it doesn't talk about how they are, how they, what they do after that. You know, you've got the white stone. In some sense, I can even, it's much easier to work out the resolution between the subconscious, unconscious, dominant functions. That I can resolve. I really can. It's the parent functions. It's like, well, if you break down that structure, what structure should you replace it with? It's just, I don't know, because the only thing in the vicinity is the inferior function in the ego. So that I can use as a scaffold. But what should I do before that? So what it's going to lead to. It's going to lead to more crucifixion. I die daily. So that's fine. But then, so what are you doing then? Are you just toying? I mean, like, I mean, I'm not saying like, what do you do? I mean, specifically with those faculties, with those dimensions of psychological reality. Is there any other important sense of triage? And in some sense, what I might be pontificating about now is essentially the need for having one final conclusive showdown, because in some sense that will resolve this question that I've just articulated. Is that the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind, looking into the future of how these things need to come into greater integration and alignment, and within the scaffolding of the New Jerusalem, which is already established from the crucifixion, that then, let's say, false permutations of false integration of the parent functions between the parent function of the unconscious and the parent function, well, in some sense, the parent function of the ego is being taken responsibility by the inferior function in the ego, which is the first day of the grave. The night before the Last Supper and the crucifixion, I believe, is the first day in the grave. It was already dead. And then the sin of the world, you're you're already dead to the sin of the world as you're being crucified. And then the pseudo child function in the superego, you're still in the grave for the child function, um, and then you wake up, or you resurrect on the dominant function in the superego. And that means that you have integrity from the superego up. But I still believe that there's a hard partition that is required, essentially between um, well, now this is different from what I originally said it, because I still believe that there needs to be a partition there, but there needs to be a partition between the fifth church and the sixth church. I believe that there's actually a hard partition, that the sixth and the seventh church, I mean, and this is talking a bit fast and loose, but the sixth and the seventh church become the province of a uh, I need to think about this. I mean, see, I always thought that the unconscious should become independent, and so that the rebirth by water is stabilized, that the renewal of the white stone of the spiritual identity, that would essentially mean that. See, it's interesting that the seventh church, it talks about buying. You purchase uh, gold that has been refined in the fire, and you purchase gold, the white raiment in the seventh church. And in the sixth church, which is Philadelphia, you learn the name of the city, the name of the city of God, and you become a pillar in the temple. Um, obviously the purchase is not a monetary thing. It's a thing about um, your values. About prizing or uh, anyway, what's the point? Is values or what? Uh, at the end of the day, all of this stuff has to become integrated anyway. Even even the subconscious's old stuff, can that isn't it can't be stable, that's just left vacant. Hmm. So if it's in the end, then does the crucifixion not continue? And the New Jerusalem takes over and creates a completely revivified 17 model. In which case, or the metafluidity of that, and then essentially the work of the seven churches is just essentially a pedagogical process. But you will need the work of the crucifixion in order to. I do think that that is what would. No, that's not what protects New Jerusalem. I think once New Jerusalem is established, what protects it is a revived child function for the superego. Is that what it would be? Hmm. And then is it really just the point of New Jerusalem that it is the template? It becomes the seed that all the sick dimensions uh, are regulated in compliance thereto. Is that not then just the final sort of thing? Is that once the crucifixion sort of ignites the pilot flame of the New Jerusalem, then you're just doing the work of the seven churches enough to provoke the beast who is not a beast but yet is, to wrestle it out with the inferior function in the ego, the work of the crucifixion, until there is a complete resolution to held charge, until all the unclean spirits, particularly in the parent function, the inferior function, and the sin of the unconscious, till those are expended. And then the Scarlet Dragon should be released. When I say released, I mean the Scarlet Dragon uh, should dissipate. Essentially, the dominant function in the ego will no longer be like a Scarlet Dragon, and it will be more conducive to the inferior function. I really want to think about an ENTP because I think, I don't want to say horrible things about people, but you see, this is why I wish I had a computer program. So what would an ENTP be? Everything would be up 5. If I know 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, counting itself, it would be up 5. So that would mean that this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So for my ENTP archetype, at least, obviously there's no direct translation between MBTI and my system, but there would be stable correspondences, I would say, generally speaking. So in ENTP, their Scarlet Dragon would be dimension 3. Interesting. No, that's not even right, what I just said. Their Scarlet Dragon is dimension 4. And their 3 frogs that need, their 3 unclean spirits will have to come out of 321. The beast and the false prophet and the dragon will be for them in 321. For me, it's 16, 15, and 14. Interesting. For Metatype 16, it'll be 2117. And their Scarlet Dragon would be 3. Yeah, I must say, I mean, Metatype 13s are so lucky that essentially the floor of their toxicity in their unconscious ideology, whatever you want to call it, is the 14th dimension, which is a purely internalized introverted thinking, which is actually capable of, which is by its functioning blames itself for its own toxicity. So in some sense, there's a huge amount of basic bootstrapping as long as you've made it to sort of Keegan stage 3.5. To use to piggyback on Keegan's model. Anyway, okay, I've spoken so much now, but yeah, I guess this is still an ongoing meditation.